ways, has contributed a lot of good to society in some fantastic ways that I don't think any of us would really discount. But at the same time, technological advances are outstripping our societal wisdom. The reason that I think a sort of interfaith conversation or collaboration around this is so key and integral is because we have now, in this sort of post-secular world, these innovations that are happening in a way that's sort of cut off from the roots of the wisdom tradition, right? And who else in culture at large might imbue technology and a technological society with that kind of wisdom other than its deep and historic faith traditions? Part of the reason why I'm excited about you all being here and what I'm hoping for our evening really is us to sort of collaborate and imagine together what kind of opportunity this might present specifically for interfaith collaborations, engagements, and conversations for a society that really could use a little dose of wisdom. And we really just wanted to open up a space for us to kind of imagine together what the benefits, the drawbacks, the bridges that are possibilities, and some of the things that inhibit some of our work and some of our passions. As we think about this in terms of interfaith, and we acknowledge the hybridity, the merging of lines, the ways that technology cuts across all that, what is the role of like a distinct identity in the midst of this sort of rampant technological overlapping of realms? Is that something that has always been the question of interfaith conversations? Is this a new time that we are now asking new and different questions than before? Or is it the same old, but in a different form?
Well, I think one of the things we've seen is the historical development of interreligious dialogue is moving it from sort of an elite conversation between learned clergy and scholars into lived religion. I think that's been a move over the years, and I can't think of a way that religion is more lived out than the display of religious practice or the description of religious practice, particularly in social media. There's an article that came out this week written by Aisha Khan where a lot of people wanted to get off of social media for Ramadan. We're in the middle of Ramadan, which is usually what I would do too. As a spiritual practice, you want to be disconnected. But then, for instance, for Muslim women, there's this hashtag that's been around for a while, started in the African-American Muslim community around Black Iftar. So around the country, people are organizing iftars or breaking a fast for Black Muslims. So for many communities, they don't see themselves in maybe the bricks and mortar religious spaces. So they are creating, in some ways, these ritual spaces. Another example was queer Muslims as well, who wanted to, for them, engaging through social media helps them get through this month of communal practice when they may not be in a space. So I think it's fascinating, that rub with finding inclusion. And I would just sort of end by saying, in particular, I think the most dangerous Islamophobic trope is that all Muslims are exactly the same. Right. And we think that's, it seems like a very innocuous thing, but it actually is highly problematic. The interfaith display is not just about Muslims talking to Christians, but a Christian person seeing in their Twitter feed Muslims of such diversity that it undermines the notion that they would all agree. And so that capacity to see how different we are internally helps to take away, I would say, dull a lot of hate, because you see Muslims or Jews or Christians that may agree with you, but you may never meet them in real life. So just, I think the capacity that technology allows for the revealing of the internal diversity of each of our traditions produces a much deeper understanding and rehumanizes the way we approach one another.
Varun, it'd be interesting to hear you comment when you're overseeing that diversity in life.
I think over the last 50 years, there has been a sort of trajectory of interfaith conversations that reflect a cultural environment in which those conversations emerge from. I would say it probably was my religion is better than yours, or maybe it started with our religions are totally different to our religions are the exact same. I think we're in a space now with young people where they say, well, our religions are different. There's similarities. We have shared goals, hopes, and aspirations that we can work around, but there are also differences, and we can be edified by those differences. We can learn from those differences. And I think the cultural context is that young people are more open to learning about the faiths of others. They don't feel threatened by learning about the faiths of others. Why? Because they know people of different faith traditions. When I went to college 20 years ago, I was the first Hindu that many people met. Now, I would be surprised if a student came to USC having never met someone of a religious minority community in the United States. Not just having met someone, but having known them, befriended them. Currently, 1/3 of all marriages in the United States are interfaith marriages. People are related to each other in different kinds of ways. And so I don't feel like my students are threatened by encountering the other. And in fact, they seek out the other. They learn to be with the other, go through their lived experiences with the other. They love the other. That's, I think, the power of a residential college. And as part of that cultural context is also, I think, the fact that people are encountering the other in social media spaces, in digital media spaces. And people can tell new stories about themselves and their world in ways they could never do before. Any one of my students can tell a story now. They all have video cameras in their pockets. They can be storytellers. They can be content producers. They can be filmmakers. They can be journalists without going through the formal training or accessing, those kinds of resources that were sort of the gateways to entering those conversations. So I see young Hindus, young Muslims, young Sikhs, young Baha'is, young Zoroastrians telling stories in ways that they never could before because the tools have changed, the technology has changed. And in doing so, those stories create an environment where people are now seeking the other. So I think that aspect sort of reinforces the culture, that students want to learn more about each other, but in part because they've encountered each other either in person or online in ways they never did before.
Where do you see them sharing those stories?
Social media, Twitter, short films. At USC, we see them in classes all the time doing student films, student journalist projects.
You're facilitating part of that too, yeah.
I think so. I think Clarissa's work is a great example of this as well. What did you find, Clarissa? I mean, you're doing something very unique. You're at a film school, the greatest film school in the world. And it's at a secular research university, but you were very open about the fact that you wanted to bring your faith into your work. And did you encounter other people who were doing similar things? Was it something that the school embraced, or do people not know how to process it?
Original question was about being a hybrid or being distinct, and I think that by the nature of being an African-American woman, I'm a hybrid as a technologist and as a storyteller, and so my lens in terms of interfaith begins at home for me because of the way African-American communities were formed in the United States, and then the way the civil rights movement took place, where the leaders of those movements for the African-American community ended up being Southern Christians or North American, African-American Muslims. And so in our communities, if you love each other, you can't say, I mean, especially as Christians, because that's what Jesus stands on, you can't say, well, we're in one fight. Are we going to be in the fight for liberties for African Americans? Or are we going to be in the fight of you can't come to the dinner table because you don't believe in Jesus? I come from a family where Catholics, within the Christianity side, we have Catholics, we have non-denominational, and we have Baptists. And then I have Muslims, African-American Muslims in my family and in my communities, and I went to school with Muslims. And so even when I hear the narrative of whatever phobias come against Islam, I can't even process it because Muslims have nurtured me. I've had to postpone Sunday dinner for my uncle's fasting. I think that just growing up with that interfaith respect sort of pushed me in the way of formation, because I learned about how to form this spirit from the traditional Catholic practices, from the Muslim practices, by watching my uncles and cousins pray 5 times a day, that they would just randomly disappear. You're like, or hearing the bell for Friday temple in the community, and being like, oh, there's a bell, they're all gonna leave now, and knowing that whatever we're gonna do, we'd have to do after that. So when I get to USC and I'm thinking about my spiritual formation as a Christian and how I want to design, I already have an open heart to be sensitive to other people's faith perspectives. And this gets very interesting when we step into the field of technology, where a lot of people are, at least from my experience, are not believers, and they are more science-based in my experience. And so I had a very, crash course in, if I tell you I'm a Christian, that may offend you because of whatever that comes with based on your belief about the self to be an atheist. But if I just start to talk to you about my relationship with God and how it informed me being your cohort member, or how it informs my children and how I, when you see them, then that shifts. So a lot of times I feel like, for at least millennials, building relationships with people of different faiths and not labeling it, right, is the bridge and opens up. And so fast forward to me sort of having this standoff when I first get there, like, you are designing for religion, and that terrifying a lot of my cohort members, to them applauding and clapping when I present my thesis work, and it is about spiritual formation in the digital age, because they know me and they know that I'm doing it because I want to create authentic spaces and free spaces for all of us, not just for Christians or African Americans or Americans,
One of your early collaborators, or was in your cohort, was himself a Hindu. He is making also like similar sort of spiritual experiences in VR. Is that correct?
Yes. So for my work, my advisors have been Christian and Hindu. When you classify yourself as Hindu?
I would.
Yeah. And then my collaborators have been atheists, Hindu, and Christian. And so one of my partner designers is Hindu. And when we worked on a virtual reality project, when we talked about ushering people into the space, it came from his experiences going into temple and in ritual-based experiences as a Hindu, and how that made him feel safe, and how that just sort of calmed the mind and would be a good practice to translate to what we were building, versus just shoving someone in a headset and scaring the life out of them.
And I noticed in working with video game students at USC, when I first got there, I assumed all of our, the video game students were going to be making first-person shooter games, right? That's what I expected. When I met with them, even though many of them aren't wearing their faith on sleeve or doing religious content per se, they were very much motivated by spiritual questions. And most of the video games I saw our students doing were focused on memory and identity and beauty and community and joy and gratitude, spiritual questions, human questions, the ultimate questions that connect us together. So in some ways, that shift from an explicitly religious identity, which is the hallmark of millennials and post-millennials. 45% of my first-year students are not formally affiliated with religion, compared to 20% of the general American public, compared to 2% of Americans in 1950. Like, this is a significant story in American religious history. Even though they've walked away from a formal affiliation with religion, they haven't walked away from meaning and purpose. They haven't necessarily walked away from God. They haven't walked away from ritual. They haven't walked away from community or joy or gratitude or the other things that make them human. And those are coming out in unique artistic spaces and ways, even if they're not explicitly religious.
Yeah, and just to follow up with what Varun's saying, so instead of speaking about sort of, I am a Christian and I'm putting my spiritual formation practices into this design, I'm a person, and the qualities or the attributes of Christ are compassion, love, joy, and this is what I'm cultivating. And you understand that because you're a person too. And so even at our thesis show, we had designs about grief, we had designs about joy, we had designs about love, we had designs about the prison industrial complex and what it means to be a free person. And we had designs about science and memory, and all of these very human-centered design projects about core empathetic elements that we all wrestle with were made by people who may or may not affiliate with the religious tradition right out loudly.
Yeah, that's, all the stuff that I've found both most fascinating and just true about, let's say, the last 50 years, right, of transition in the U.S. is it's not, as some of the secularist theorists would have said, that religion is declining. It's that it's just spreading into different forms and going by different names. And that's why part of me thinks like, oh, this is a really interesting moment that we could collaborate with people of various different sort of persuasions to say, what is that sort of core human thing that connects us when the other sort of structures and powers, the status quo wants to disconnect us and divide us? What are ways that we can draw from that sort of religious identity to invest it, but in a way that's expansive, open, kind of what you're saying, of as opposed to being exclusive in our affiliation, to be actually open in that sense. I wonder, Faisal, if you could say something about how that plays itself out in the medical community, because we're talking about sort of spiritual health in some ways, mental health, identity. Where's sort of the opportunities you're seeing as you're thinking technology, and you're a neurologist?
Yeah, I'm a neurologist. So yeah, exclusively with chest and up.
The brain.
The brain itself. But I mean, just to a broader question that Najiba alluded to, the demise that we were predicting of religion, due to technology in the 1990s, all those fears, that turned out to be unfounded, right? Because religion survived and it's there. And so most of the religious discussions are dialogue-based or communicative. And that's where most of the technology that we're dealing with. And social media, it has its limitations, significant limitations, even though you're seeing people connecting, but the algorithms are fairly limiting. And it's very frustrating. And just to give you an example, the other day I liked somebody's comment on Alabama abortion bill, or had made some comment on somebody who might have posted an article. Next thing I know, my entire feed is full of all these abortion bills. Then I go to someone else who's never liked or commented on it. There's nothing to mention that. So these are very limiting pockets that we're developing. Mm-hmm. And it gets frustrating. Once in a while, I have connected with, had a discussion, debate, argument on social media with somebody of opposing view, less progressive than me, for example. But then that's very, very limiting. And for me, my own education as a result, my own ability to learn what people are saying is limited, and much frustratingly so. In medicine, though, both in medicine and the tech world, like you mentioned, religion is not mentioned. It's not discussed. Still remains fairly a taboo medical field. I mean, I can't sit in a doctor's lounge and talk about religion, or I can't, talk about a family's right to have sort of the religious preferences dictate what brain death looks like, or what future care looks like. Openly discuss it amongst other physicians, because it doesn't really get taken very seriously. Technology is there to prove one way or the other. For example, if there's sufficient technology to demonstrate that somebody is brain dead or is not going to survive. But then that's it. That's the limit of technology. That's the limit of our discussion with the families. It doesn't go beyond that. And not in the social sphere or religious spheres, or understanding their spiritual needs, or what's to come next. And so in medicine is fairly limiting as well. But in tech world, I know in tech companies, it's also fairly limiting, because it's not like people are discussing. I mean, they have, from what I understand, that a lot of the tech companies in Silicon Valley have what they call interfaith support groups. Operationally, what comes out of that I don't know. I don't fully understand the product of that, beyond it being a support group. And in medicine, so I have to take extra time to discuss with my medical students about limitations of medical technology vis-a-vis just really it's a science that's attempting to be precise. Beyond that, it doesn't mean that it gives you a human touch. It has to you have to go beyond looking people's social spheres to see what their needs are, social needs are. I mean, hospitals. I work at a Catholic hospital too, which is a very interesting experience working out of a Catholic hospital, entire Catholic system, one of the largest ones here now in Southern California. But there's specific programs that are designed to have that human touch. Both the social workers, the chaplaincies, the chaplains there, they do this. I mean, this is a very elaborate program to address those needs. That's really refreshing to see, but it is also unique to just that institution. It's not something that's prevalent in medicine. So in a way, technology has severe limitations. And I think technology, especially communicative technology, social media, has to do a lot more to connect people than it is doing now. I think from my experience, it's been much more limiting than I would have liked it to be.
Yeah, I mean, my hero, my man crush, is a guy named Jaron Lanier. I don't know if you guys know. He's one of these early designers of Web 2.0, and I was working on 3.0. And he's one of the Silicon Valley people that none of their children are on anything, right? Because of what they're seeing. And it's this interesting balance between kind of what you're saying of these social movements for people that were disenfranchised or marginalized, finding their voice in their community in ways that otherwise we wouldn't. At the same time, the algorithms for those technologies are written to, get impressions. And impressions are driven by, I like it or I hate it. And then you have moneyed interests that are paying to raise those up. Mm-hmm. And turns out there are 5 companies in the world that own all of it. And it's in their interest to keep us divided, then we add to that other nation states and stuff that are actually entering our discourse. So I wonder, McCall, I've noticed, so tell me if this is wrong, that you have been what I would call reserved in your public social media presence, specifically as it concerns the development of your interfaith relationships. So it seems like we're saying we need some sort of discernment or wisdom as how we navigate these things between the great goods of communicating and connection to some of the isolation and fragmenting. Have you thought strategically about that, or how do you think about your presence online?
Right, yeah. No, it's a good question. This may sound weird to say, but it is definitely true. I wish I was more like Najiba in that. It's honestly true because she's so good at it. She's very good about keeping her private life private, keeping her kids' names off social media, their faces, those type of things, but still be very bold in showing like, hey, this book you should read. This is something you should explore. And so, one day when I grow up. So I actually used to be extremely active on social media, especially Facebook in the very beginning. Every single time I hung out with a Muslim, I just posted about it. It was we're having coffee. May not seem interesting, but I know my community is watching, and for them, this is a big deal. And so after doing that for 2 years very consistently, almost posting every single day, constantly posting articles, or whenever something was happening internationally, I would always try to find a story that would counter it of like, hey, here's another side to it, or have you thought of this angle? I think for me personally, I got very tired of just all the comments I constantly got and having to, every time I wanted to post something to kind of push the envelope, it was so much work to then be online for quite a while right after because my Muslim friends might like something, then someone else might not like something, and it would become this mess. And so it's like, I can't just post something and then leave it. I need to monitor what's happening so that no one gets hurt in the process, or if someone's being derogatory, that they get removed. But then you also have to deal with that and send them private messages. So I think just for me, that part of it got too tiresome. On Facebook specifically. But the good thing that did come out of that, I think, in the first 2 years when I first started very proactively working in Muslim-Christian peace building, after 2 years of constantly posting pictures, I had this woman sending me a message in the inbox and saying, like, I've just been watching you for the past 2 years, constantly posting images, and I was afraid you were going to lose your faith and you're going to become Muslim, and very afraid for you. And I started praying for you, or something like evil might happen to you. But I'm seeing like you've been doing this for 2 years now, and you're just having coffee and you're having fun, and and so
it's a lot of coffee,
right? It's a lot of coffee. It was just, and so she said, and I realized that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I am the one that needs change in this, and maybe I need to make a Muslim friend as well. And I've been scared of doing that for the past 2 years, but seeing that you're fine, I know it sounds very terrible, but she felt like, okay, I want to come to one of your events and make a Muslim friend. So I do think like it has a huge impact, and it can hugely change. I think where I'm moving now more is in creating stories primarily on YouTube. I think people have gotten kind of tired of Facebook, but at least for myself, YouTube is still a very interesting space to watch short videos and clips on things. And so we're working on a lot of amazing stories that have happened behind the scenes that we haven't been public about, turning them into high quality, good videos that we will post. And so I think my strategy in that sense maybe has changed. But the primary reason for me pulling back was just I got tired of monitoring. Yeah.
It can be exhausting.
Yeah.
And I think that there are now religious leaders in each of our communities that they wouldn't exist but for social media. Mm-hmm. And, or they would exist. I mean, I think about, I watched the morning of Rachel Held Evans as an outsider. Mm-hmm. And I mourned her too, not just in that moment, but because I'd also followed her social media. And so I think in some ways, particularly around grief, every couple of months I post something about how to help and process online grief, because it's sort of grief by proxy. You don't actually have to be directly related to the person. And so the way that we grieve is really important. And I was going to speak really briefly about the interaction between different platforms. So I think, for instance, you now have online streaming of shows that happen. And so I remember watching and talking, there's a whole set of Twitter folks on Muslims on Game of Thrones that are like, don't watch it, it's un-Islamic. But then there's a whole group of people discussing it. Mm-hmm. And to me, it was a show that had so much religion in it, right? And a conversation around religion. But another example is a show that just came out on Netflix, or Hulu, sorry, called Rami, that a young Muslim comedian did. And to me, what was fascinating wasn't actually just the show, but the conversation that happened, particularly on Twitter, after the show came out or as the show is coming out. So I think for me, looking at how these different platforms interact, and a lot of people rely on apps for spiritual practices now. I mean, every time we pray, a lot of us have an app that reminds us. Meditation apps are amongst the most popular apps right now. So I think in some ways, we're ritualizing our practice, utilizing technology. I don't even know what the time is. I don't look at the sun anymore for setting. My app goes off and the adhan goes, and so I respond to the adhan on my phone instead of going outside and looking at the sun, which is fascinating. And so I just, I think keeping in mind that it's a constantly changing ecosystem. And to me, what's powerful isn't just the storytelling, as Michal is talking about, but the conversations that come out of the storytelling and the interactions that happen out of it.
I don't just not watch the time. I don't trust the weather. I look out and it's raining and I'm like, I don't know about that. It's interesting, the grieving thing is really fascinating to me because, so Rachel Held Evans is a really great example that she kind of came up on the technological upslope of bloggers and then Twitter and this other stuff and leveraged that, and then also created the careers of multiple other authors
Absolutely,
and people
by
because of her.
Them. Yeah.
And what was fascinating to me about grieving her loss as both a public figure and then as a Christian figure, who I thought was doing a lot of just amazing things, was that I knew her personally, but purely in a digitally mediated way. And when she died, it was the same week that my wife's best friend died. She was a young woman, a mom of some kids that same age as ours, so like good family friends. And it was a really odd space to be mourning at the same time a person that I knew in a sort of fully embodied way, and then another person that I knew in a fully mediated way. And so it's had me thinking like, well, what, as you're saying, like it's changed the way we grieve in some ways?
It's a form of digital intimacy.
Yeah. So do you think, as my only thought was, the only difference there is my body being present with them, I think, and that might be wrong. And then I thought, as in terms of our spiritual practices, spiritual traditions, our bodies are involved in a lot of that, right? We discipline our bodies, we use our bodies in the devotional practices, we bring our bodies together with other bodies in worship or some sort of devotional practice. What do you think the role of our bodies is now in this new grieving context?
I mean, I think certainly every tradition has rituals of grief that are embodied. So, and I think others can speak to this as well. What I think is helpful about these sort of relationships that we develop, sort of an extension of our body in multiple spaces, is that we no longer all watch the same TV show and have a cultural experience together. So in some ways, the way we're sharing space and time is very embodied. Even though I see a Twitter feed about a particular figure that's passed away, I'm responding in my body is responding. So we're in a constant negotiation. So sometimes where our body ends and where technology starts, to think of this idea of transhumanism, is really emerging in this space. But I don't think, in some ways, we try to complexify it so much and remove it as if this has never happened. To me, it's the village crier who is in the square, to kind of think of Habermas as looking at it in the public square more theoretically, but to even take it down to the very basic level, the way gossip functions socially. In some ways, social media is playing that role for us. Obviously, it's amplified. I do have concerns that there are some serious downsides having children myself. Thinking through what are the ethics of social media, what are the ways that we talk about utilizing social media for common good. Because I do think that is a conversation unmitigated. Not just social media, but technology can be used for purposes that are very, very negative. So as I think about how my students are being formed, that is one of the conversations that I have with them as well, is how are you utilizing this as a tool? I work in the area of interreligious justice movements. Absolutely, social media functions to organize. I work a lot with Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. Social media brings together so many people for all these different actions. So we get together and do a public ritual, but the act of even just getting together isn't possible without social media. So it's directly feeding into a real life, in the real world, social good.
Jim, if I may just, in terms of these embodied experience, as for congregational ritual requirements, for example, prayers, congregational prayers in a mosque 5 times a day, which nobody in the United States really does. We don't have access to mosques that readily. So it's not, among the American Muslim community, it's not like a defined culture that everybody's going to mosque 5 times a day to pray. That's practically impossible. But obviously, we understand that social media is not going to necessarily replace that. Those are very definitive requirements that gives you a very different, unique social experience. But then I think follow-up conversations do to transform or continue on the social media thereafter. And at the same time, though, as far as interfaith dialogue goes, my sense is that we're having a lot of intrafaith, more enhanced intrafaith dialogue. But where's the interfaith exchange? I was looking for data on that, and that data is scarce. Except for that, I realized that Google had done some data collection, and both the searches for terms interfaith and interreligious had steadily declined quite drastically over the last decade. This is Google's own search engine optimization research. Whether that doesn't mean that we're moving away from value-based discussions or searches, but certainly that terminology is maybe not as useful. And despite the fact that in the United States searches on religion usually is much higher than the rest of the world, and as you well know, in our context, searches for Muslim and Islam have incredibly gone up or steadily gone up. Not necessarily all good. I mean, it's been problematic too, but that's this concordance we have.
Yeah, it's interesting because you were talking about noting that Islam is not a monolithic thing, and it's important to see the diversity in there. I think internally, the American Christian consciousness has, for many years, thought of itself as monolithic, and is realizing anew, oh, wait, you do Christianity in a way different way than I do. And in fact, I'd like to not be associated with you anymore because of what you're doing. And a lot of times it's online. Are you finding that? I mean, because Ryan, you do that sort of stuff with your students and thinking about sort of emerging adults, millennials. Is that something you're seeing in the uprise? We need to have intra-faith conversations, step one, before we can even imagine having a constructive interfaith conversation?
I think it's been happening since the 70s in one way or another in terms of American spirituality, but people are seeing their spiritual life as a set of practices that, and not necessarily seeing other people as part of fully enclosed systems. And so they're wanting to take on particular practices, and they may borrow. And for a while within Christianity, they were borrowing within the Christian sort of traditions. And so they might have gone to a Catholic retreat or done the stages of the cross, or they've, different sorts of Christian practices. But as we've gone deeper into the 21st century, they're just more and more Americans are borrowing from any sort of tradition that they are seeing as helpful. So you have many nuns, N-O-N-E-S, doing all sorts of different meditative practices that may or may not be within their tradition, or different service projects. I noticed when I was studying the emerging Christian movement in the early 2000s, one of the scary things that made them different from previous, maybe evangelical movements, is they were willing to do interfaith service projects, which had scared before 2000 the Christians before. And they felt like that wouldn't take away their faith by participating in interfaith.
Yeah, that's the woman who's commenting on McCall's Facebook, right?
Yeah, and so that's changing and transforming, and you're having more and more folks practicing a very eclectic spirituality, which has a lot of people nervous within some of the, within the faith traditions that don't like to see that borrowing beyond the border of their faith.
I would say for me, having interfaith dialogue on an academic level via YouTube and Barnes and Nobles, however I got access to people, the thought leaders outside of my faith, gave me a clearer perspective on how spiritual formation traditions in my faith work. So for instance, one of the books that I read when I was, my background's in finance. So me even sitting here as an interaction designer and the 10-year trajectory it took for me to pivot from that point involved a lot of my own personal spiritual formation work. And one of the books that I read was Living Buddha, Living Christ by Thich Nhat Hanh, and follows some of the teachings of like Eckhart Tolle or Deepak Chopra. And when they talked about, at first, when they started to talk about meditation and mindfulness, I thought that I was learning something new. I thought that I was learning something that was different from how I had practiced prayer and as a Christian. But then I was invited to a workshop on breathing and mindfulness at the Art of Living Institute by the USC area. And what I learned through that experience was that I had been meditating my entire life through the African-American culture of worship. And so tying this to, I work as a visiting scholar now. I'm a visiting scholar. Before I was just a student, but now that I'm not a student anymore, they allow me to be a visiting scholar at the Creative Media and Behavioral Health Lab at USC, which is a partnership between the Interactive and Media and Games Division of USC, the Harvard Child Development Center, and then the Keck School of Medicine. So it's all about just how can we use media to improve our behavioral health. And so I learned about affect regulation and neuroplasticity and what sort of thoughts and certain concepts and ideations in our brain ruminated over extended periods of time due to our neurological system. And so speaking about this idea of when being embodied or disembodied, the more you create a clear concept of something in your brain, the pain that you feel isn't going to be any different from the physical pain or the pleasure that you feel in some instances. And so when I thought about that and I was learning about meditation, I'm like, wow, we as the African-American people in our sort of Negro spirituals out of the antiquity era all the way up through now, through gospel music, have been training our minds and have been affect regulating forever. We just don't call it meditation. And so I use that to put into my design for my meditative apps and tools. And I don't necessarily say, hey, worship music is in chanting, and I don't say it like that, but I offer people this experience of how to control your breath, how to have visual pleasure through visuals that relate to you, and how to sustain focused thinking over time that will calm your mind and help you better get a perspective on life that is pleasing to your system and your thinking. And people like it, and they don't have to know that they are meditating or praying or whatever labels we want to put on it. It works, and that's what they're like. I feel calmer. I have a better perspective on my own well-being, and I liked the sound of that music and those visuals, right?
Yeah. Could it be that as we think about sort of interfaith partnerships and collaborations, especially around technology, that we would continue to do some of those sort of shared initiatives toward the common good that we could rally around? But is there something, I'm hearing something like the future of interfaith collaboration is mental and behavioral health. Something like that. Does that sound right to you?
I think that's worth unpacking. I know that social media technology has been this great connective tissue that has brought us together. That's not always what I see. Actually, I often see the opposite. I see the dark side of social media. Our students are really struggling in terms of their mental and spiritual health. And at the root of it is what, in my experience with students, of course, there's increasing levels of stress, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation across American college campuses. But at the root of it, I think, is a spiritual crisis of loneliness. Our students are really, really, really lonely. I get the question every week that I never got in the first 5 years at USC, and that is, how do I make friends? I'm teaching classes on friendship now and I can't even keep up with the demand. They fill up immediately on sort of basic sort of interpersonal relationship building. Research data has historically said that it's the eldest people in our country who are the loneliest, and that loneliness is a sort of, it can be a cause of actually premature death. It's significant physical health consequences too. But now, recently, researchers have told us that the loneliest generation in America right now are post-millennials, those who are under 25. So what's different about post-millennials? Well, they are the first generation in human history to be entirely born and raised in an online social environment, where many of their most meaningful interactions, from tragedy to triumph, happen online, where they may have 1,000 friends online, but they don't know what it means to be a friend offline, where they're really good at talking with their thumbs, but not so much with their tongues. And this has led to a feeling of psychological dislocation for a lot of young adults. And in many ways, they are a guinea pig generation. For 50,000 years, we've sat around and talked like this. And with this generation, we're saying, here's a whole new way to talk and communicate and be human and be in community and be in tribe. And what I find with our students is that their loneliness comes from a space where they feel like they don't belong. And that they're comparing the real life that they lead to the curated, idealized life of everyone else. And everyone else has figured it out but them. Everyone else has friends but them. Everyone else has a career but them. Everyone else belongs but them. And when I think young people on college campuses talk a lot about inclusion, what they're really talking about is belonging. And where can I find my tribe? Where can I belong? And so I see the dark side of social media. Of course, it's not, correlation doesn't equal causality. And there are other factors that are unique to post-millennials, including the rise of active shooters on campus, the religious disaffiliation, the high price of tuition, the disrupted economies, et cetera. But you cannot deny the fact that social media exacerbates these tensions, anxieties, and stresses quite a bit. There was an article in 2017 in Atlantic magazine, Has the iPhone Destroyed a Generation of Students?, which charts the exponential rise of stress, anxiety, and depression on high school campuses to the 2007 release of the iPhone. And so it's no wonder why the people who have created these technologies won't let their children use it. It's no wonder why the people who bring us Twitter and Facebook take internet Sabbaths, where they just go offline for the weekend or they go in retreat and they get away from that kind of technology, even though they've made their money on that technology. And for me, I've never been on social media. I've never had a Facebook account. I've never had a Twitter account. I don't know how it works. I don't feel like I've missed out that much, quite frankly. And I have other opportunities and other platforms to communicate. But our students don't have that chance. And even our students who recognize sort of the negative impact that social media and constantly being online has in their life. And by the way, 50% of our students, post-millennials, say that internet connectivity is essential to them as food, shelter, and water. Even if they realize that this isn't healthy for me and they disconnect, they end up feeling lonelier because all their friends are online and they don't know what anyone's doing or what's happening in the world.
So I think that's interesting that Varun brought that up, because I spent a lot of time in solitude learning about spiritual formation before I entered the university life. And I entered as an older graduate student. So I had 6 years, 7 years in my finance career and in communications career before I went back to school. When I walked into Varun's office one day and he told me that the #1 issue on campus was loneliness and people were trying to figure out how many friends, I said, it makes sense. I've been feeling that. In the context of my life with spiritual formation and understanding the difference between loneliness and solitude, right, gave me a better lens and a better way to approach it. And this is why I get so excited, because when I talk about technology, I'm not talking about social media. Obviously, I do see in the future of the things that I'm working on and the things that my colleagues are working on having a social media component, but you can only be effective socially to the extent that you are well with yourself. I can only share with others what is going, in a healthy way, what is working healthy in me. Even grief is healthy, right? Like, so that's not to say if you're feeling a sad emotion that's not healthy. It is healthy if the context of your life, you lost someone or, give way to that. On social media specifically, communities, like there's groups for moms, and I'll go in those and I can talk about, all mom stuff, breastfeeding, all kinds of stuff. And those types of little niche things in the context of social media help people form relativity, which decreases cognitive dissonance. Because it's, if I have a thought in my brain, but the world is anti the thought, then I feel like I don't belong. And so when we talk about the future of virtual reality and augmented reality and curated digital spaces that are manipulatable based on the designer thinking about the different end users and what their inputs could dictate as outputs, there's a whole world of possibility in terms of mirroring back to people validation for how they feel and helping them work through that and use what they get out of it in the embodied world and in the virtual space. And it's promising, but we have to start to separate like what's going on in social media and its limited perspective.
And you bring up a good point, because those control settings or control groups with the purpose, that you're describing, there are opportunities there for an interfaith exchange, right? Just to give you an example, I had a patient who, for the first time, I learned about Fuller's the addiction and substance abuse 9 to 12 step program from this patient of mine who was actually studying, who's a student here studying that. So then I thought this is very unique because I haven't really seen that in my community. And how do I get access to that information vis-a-vis, because this falls within that, mental health arena. And I think that kind of transfer of information via social media or propagation of information or courses or digital communication can be very useful, because one of the things that's lacking is propagation of these beneficial ideas. The propagatory mechanisms are still, because social media has a lot of noise. It's in general, it's very difficult to package useful information. Maybe somebody like Najiba can do it. She's an expert. But for most people, it's just noise. Click on something or just read a 2-minute article. Now the articles tell you if the read is 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So you can choose.
It does.
How much time you want to spend reading it. But those are the type of things I think interfaith dialogue can move into, because there's a lot of. This is not encroaching on any theological space, but this is very useful information that people on the ground communities really need and can operate.
Well, it's interesting, too, because connecting what both of you are saying is where, again, sort of religious traditions or sensibilities offer certain frameworks for discerning things and distinguishing things that are important. So there is something different between technology that we might talk about and social media and Web 2.0 sort of platforms, right? And it's important for us to distinguish because the benefits and drawbacks of those are different. And what you're describing in terms of curating space all requires a kind of agency that right now in certain spaces, none of us have. I've done some work in research in trauma and studying on trauma. So I think of like the active school shooters, and that we're also in the society of perpetual trauma and re-traumatization along racial lines, along religious lines, especially post-millennials. And I think if there's a sense in which we can constructively steer the ship towards the sort of vision you're describing, part of that has to be a reclamation of our own agency online. We have an alum, Fuller alum, and I'm very proud of our Fuller alum, mainly because they go do these things that I'm like, what? You had a theology degree and you're doing that? But one guy's name's Phil Chin, and he is it's another interesting job title. It's not a jokester, or what'd you say, the Google?
Jolly good fellow.
Yeah, but he works for HTC, and he designed the original e-reader that Barnes & Noble's ended up buying as their thing. He designed the first Android smartphone for HTC. Now he's just designed the first blockchain phone, and he's calling it the Exodus. And it's essentially to say we can't talk about privacy or identity or how we control any of these things going on until we can actually own our digital identities. They're owned, and we give them away for free. And he's doing this out of his religious conviction to say it's an important thing for us to have ownership of our agency online, for us to create these spaces for health and well-being. And of course, I ask him the question of, well, what's between now and then, right? Like, how do we continue to navigate those spaces that everybody's on? It seems like the only option is everybody all at once has to jump off. Otherwise, we're left with the same sort of status quo. So, Najeeba, since you seem to be our expert social media person here.
No, I'm not necessarily. I actually wrote, one of the articles I've written was about spiritual formation utilizing social media.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, one way to look, I think we're speaking about different spheres of knowledge. One of them is informational. And I think one of the greatest promises of both technology and social media is the delivery of ancient traditions in accessible ways. I mean, I think that cannot be underestimated. There are times in traditions where women couldn't touch the holy text in different traditions, you know? And so to me, I think particularly coming from my positionality, I've seen both social media and technology open up doors that couldn't exist before. So I think it depends on if you had access before, you might, you know, in the politics of nostalgia, wish for a time when only certain people had access, right? So we have to be careful about what we're hearkening back to, because in some ways, some doors have been opened and technology and social media have allowed for religious literacy, both in one's tradition and across tradition in ways that couldn't have happened before. But I also think, so we have that informational piece. Unfortunately, the part around religious literacy that's highly problematic is that many websites, for instance, that are about Islam are funded by Islamophobic groups. So we also have to be careful. I think technology opens the door to religious illiteracy as well. And the more that your algorithms get narrow, the more difficult it is to overcome because you've read 1,000 times that Islam says this or Christianity says that. So I think thinking through religious literacy and illiteracy that are essentially products of these interactions. So we have the informational piece, but I think we have the relational as well. And as we know, researchers talk about thin relationships through social media. So you have 1,000 friends, but those are thin relationships. So I've found, I guess, I don't know if, unlike Varun, I'm actually on social media. But I'm really, I mean, for me, part of the reason I do it is that I have been told, for instance, by so many young Muslim women, but also just young women across different traditions, just seeing a woman who displays her faith really clearly and just goes into all kinds of spaces. Or seeing me, I was at a iftar the other night, a breaking of fast that was put together by a friend who's a Sikh woman. And just the picture of me with a Sikh woman was transformational for an international audience to see two women occupy that space together. So the visual, the optics of it, the way that my embodied presence has deconstructed not just what people think about Muslims, but the inevitability that, for instance, Muslims and Jews will work together. So it's fascinating to me that that imagery is actually transformational because it deconstructs this inevitability of conflict. So I don't know if Michal may have some ideas around that, but I think the optics of it are so important, and it can be detrimental, as we just spoke about, but in many ways it can also bring a lot of hope in spaces and places where people feel so traumatized. So we have the capacity to inflict harm, but we also have the capacity to heal in some ways.
Yeah, I always love this quote from Martin Luther King. He says, like, the people who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. Mm-hmm. And I think social media has unfortunately been used to instigate war and recruitment for extremist groups and that kind of thing. We can't ignore that it exists or like, oh, let me just hide from it. I think there are plenty of examples of beautiful things that are happening, but they're not enough. And so I think it needs to be, because it goes down in your feed or it disappears from being a recent video or in the algorithms. And so we need to constantly pump out positive, inspiring, prejudice attacking kind of content that's key. And I mean, there's amazing examples, like, for example, right around the exact same time that Pastor Jones, the guy in Florida who wanted to do a Burn the Quran Day, right? And so him wanting to do that locally, because there was so much media attention to it, it could potentially have people could have lost their lives as a result of that. And I think maybe they did or didn't. I'm not sure on the cause of it, but he, just with that small act of what he was doing and all the attention on it and that being plastered all over everybody all around the world, put people's lives in danger. At the exact same time that that was happening, there was also Pastor Stones, it's kind of funny, Pastor Stones, in Memphis, Tennessee, who welcomed the Muslim community. And so he put this poster out. Starbucks made a little video about it later, welcoming the Muslim community to Memphis and saying, like, okay, I know you're building your building, you don't have it yet, you can use our space to pray for a while. And so CBS did a local little piece on that. And that was seen around the world as well and had an effect on people saying, like, wow, this pastor is welcoming to Muslims, we need to be welcoming to people of other religions. And so that's why I think we have to be very proactive in that. It's not something you can just wait for it to happen. And that's why, you know, with the work that I've been doing with Muslims and Christians locally, and increasingly also exploring what would that be, like Hindu, Muslim. I have a friend who lives in India and wants to do similar things there. Really bringing that content out there and making that available, and somehow try to see if we can tweak or, you know, get over the algorithm so that we get into the space of the people that wouldn't see it.
I do think a lot of content producers around religion have been way behind.
Yes.
So the product is not as sexy.
No, it
it's
needs
not
to be
as,
quality.
So how do you balance having a spiritual center, having ethics around representation with being able to compete in that marketplace? I think that is a balance as well. You know, I'm always telling really prominent Muslim scholars, I wish you were on Twitter. I wish you were, because the folks that are tweeting and are really active on Facebook, there are some wonderful scholars that have a huge following. But there are many who don't, and they see it as problematic, or it's beneath them, or, you know, and I try to sort of explain to them how important it is, because as you said, the messages of the negative messages, the calls to hate are so, unfortunately, well produced. And so, I mean, I think that is something to think about, is the resources that are put into, you know, I think, into the digital space, whether it's a product or an app, or it's, you know, whatever the platform is. I do think we often lag behind as religious actors. So maybe others have something to say about
as
that.
Technology, you know, being a tool, it can be used to divide us. It can be used to bring us together. I think it's important to recognize, though, that what we're talking about is nothing new.
Yes.
The efficacy of religious teaching, of our wisdom traditions, has always been a function of technology, especially in terms of how those messages are distributed around the world. The ancient traditions, where you only had an oral tradition, didn't spread very far. The Vedic traditions only sort of resided in the Indian subcontinent. By the advent of the printing press, suddenly you could print books and send them all over the world, and people were sort of engaging and consuming ideas they could never have otherwise encountered. And now that we're in the information age, I mean, you have someone like Bob Marley, who people think of as a prophet of his tradition, the Rastafarian faith. He spread an island denomination around the world in 10 years. Why? Because he had recording technology. He had popular culture technology. He was able to get into spaces where he didn't actually have to physically go. And now in this day and age where everything is streaming, you can touch a button and put your message out there. And so I have seen technology as a force for healing and reconciliation and redemption. At USC, we're doing a VR project with wounded warriors around PTSD, and we recreate the environment in which their trauma happened, and we walk them through a virtual reality sort of experience, and that has actually been very healing for that kind of trauma. At the Shoah Foundation, we have the largest visual archive in the world. It's mostly Holocaust survivors talking about their experiences. And now we've created holograms of those survivors where students can then have full conversations. One of our students had a conversation with one of their relatives who they took from video and created a hologram of. And that also can have a great sense of sort of reconciliation, redemption. It can prevent future atrocities, et cetera. So I think at the end of the day, these are tools. They've been used for good. They've been used for bad historically. But the idea, this conversation around religion and technology, that's always been the conversation. It's a new iteration now, but it's an old idea.
It seems like what you guys are suggesting is that film and digitalization, the back end stuff, before social media,
Yeah.
is doing a lot more.
The
And I
storytelling.
think that growth in that field
Yeah.
will ultimately maybe
That's
as it
right.
gets posted. But a bigger question for all of you, is how do you get into difficult conversations? And I'll give you an example. I met one of the local churches. I was looking at this list of speakers, and almost on a monthly basis, they had a speaker, extremely Islamophobic speaker, because the content and the title and their books and articles could just tell you that. I met one of the pastors outside of a Rotary meeting. So we came out and began to talk, and he introduced himself. I said, okay, well, so you're from that church. So tell me what's going on. Why is it that you have one after another this ensemble of extremely anti-Muslim speakers? Can you explain that to me? And then so he gave me just the plethora, the list of the typical verses we're used to hearing about, kill the infidels and this and that. So there's an algorithm too that's very standard. So he gave me the whole list. Okay, I discussed the list with him. And then I started talking about the work we do in the community. Whether it's food drives or health fairs or vaccinations, a lot of local service projects that me and colleagues and various group members do. And then at the end of the day, when he left me, he said, you and your work is a credit to your race. And that's what he parted with. And I don't know if that conversation could have ever taken place in a social media sphere. But now you mentioned these movements that, at the turn of, this 2000 decade, and there's more interest in interfaith dialogue. But my question is, how do I really get into talking to these folks? Because this is when I feel like my interfaith priority should be.
So I was going to talk about just who the content creators are, and the fact that people who are experts in wisdom and in academia and in these very thoughtful fields of discipline, from my perspective, haven't necessarily been hybrids and haven't understood art or visual appeal and what appeals to the eye. And when we start to look at who's been doing that, it's been artists and it's been business people trying to promote consumerism. So in that same Martin Luther King quote, I look at it as much as we have used the visual pleasure to promote consumerism, we need to use it to start to speak to society about producing that which is in you. And so right now what's happening, it's like a catch-all, right? Like online, it's like sort of like your superstore of just people's random thoughts. And the content curators who hold the wisdom aren't necessarily in the avenues for whatever reasons that may be. And so how do we start to, the tradition, or like what, maybe 50 years ago, it's like, you can only do one thing. You can only do one thing. And then you have millennials who are like, no, we don't want to do one thing. We want to be all that we can be, right? But that's good, because in that cross-disciplinary training, we start to make room for the marriage of fields that complement each other. So information is like data. It's like the back end, but who's the user interface experience designer, right, of that information? And are they thinking about who the consumer is and how they would like to receive that information? And we have to think about that. There was an old sitcom where the father talked about, if I make you a really good steak and I put all of the, dressings on it and the onions, but I serve it to you on a trash can, will you eat it? And so how are we serving this information? I think it's very is very important to think about.
I think religion is taught didactically, and that's the pedagogy of many traditions, and that isn't the way that this space operates most effectively. So in some ways, we have to change our pedagogical and public engagement as faith or religious leaders. Anyways, I was just going to put that out there. I think that's a learning process for how to do that.
One really simple thing that I've learned, my introduction to graduate teaching was online. My first opportunities were all as an adjunct teaching online because that's what was available. So I've had to translate into physical classrooms, and I'm often like, I have to show up every week? Really? But one of the things that I found in terms of like the media, the digital content that I then produce has been really fascinating because it's somewhat just pragmatics, but a lot of it looks like this, where instead of the sort of didacticism of a lecture or a monologue as I'm delivering information, I started hosting conversations and then making those available digitally to all the students that are around the world for Fuller. And I thought, okay, well, that's just what I have to do. I don't have any other option. But what I found out was, one, the students responded completely differently to a sort of guided conversation that sometimes you didn't always know where it was going to go, that they felt they could see themselves in the conversation better. And then even more, if it's a podcast or something else, they're listening to it in the car with the people carpooling who aren't in the educational sphere, and they're talking about it. And I go, wait a minute, my colleagues who, we spend so much time writing books and then 3 people read it. I go, if we just shifted a bit our pedagogical sort of assumptions, all of a sudden I think we're accomplishing some things that we always hoped we were. Maybe we assumed were happening in the brick and mortar classroom that maybe never were. And that really, I think, has been a sort of paradigm shift for me in terms of what do I think it means to teach religion? And then back to, I think, one of your very first things, it really then grounds you back to lived religion, right? It's back to the end user. And if you start with those questions, maybe we should have always started with those. Whatever technology we were using, maybe, and I'll just speak for my own Protestant Christian tradition of how we've educated, there was a while where we didn't really care about the end user because we had the info literally in the books and sometimes in the brains of the people that stood up and told you stuff, and you came and we dispensed the wisdom to you. And that just world doesn't exist anymore.
And that just gets me so excited
Oh.
because it's kind of like we've always had these gatekeepers. And I don't mean to, I know that can be sort of not a nice term if you're one of the gatekeepers, right? But we've had people curating information for us across, not just in church, but like what we watch on a Friday night. Based on television programming, what's playing on the radio, music programmers. We've had programmers who may or may not necessarily have an empathetic lens on who we are and what type of art and information really relates to us and where we are. And so for me, this journey started with trauma and having a huge, a very deep Christian background, wondering how my faith could inform me through that trauma outside of going to church on Sunday and Bible study on Wednesday night, and realizing that the sermon that the pastor may have preached may or may not have applied to how I was feeling on Monday or Tuesday. And how could I use interaction design to sort of personalize how I received information? And then learning about how children learn through experimental sort of play and figuring out how something works for them. And that's really how the brain really sustains and absorbs information. And that interaction design is all about that. We used to sit and have to watch an hour of whomever, we're like Oprah, but now you can watch the 5-minute clip of the segment of the show that you care about, right? I don't really care about you telling me about the latest hairdryer, but I do care about the 5 minutes that you interviewed Will Smith and talked about Aladdin and the genie. So I only have to watch that now. And we have to do that with religion as well. We have to do that with how we present faith, because I may not want to really understand how all 4 gospels relate to each other and what stories are in John that are not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I may just want to hear the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about worrying, because I'm really worrying today. And in that, if you give me that little piece and I can absorb it, then I want more. Because now I trust you, right? Like, I trust your effectiveness in my real lived experience.
Ryan, is she hitting on, it's a term that I think you stole from someone, but I stole from you.
Which one?
Producer, but misspelled, or is it consumer that you spell differently? Where you're a producing consumer kind of thing.
Producer, they were using that term. Yeah, where you're, well, it's just like what you were talking about with, the fact that, and that people can tell their stories. And so the idea that we had a producer economy up through the 60s and then a consumer economy from 70s on, where it was pretty much you were passive and receiving. Even the early internet we were just receiving this Web 1.0 experience. And then after the 2000s, and especially with YouTube, all of a sudden we're producers, where we're producing consumers, we're creating. And so the idea that I could tell my story in the 1940s, 1950s, that would have cost me $5 million to tell my story. But by the time the 2000s come, we can do that for the cost of our communication device. That idea that, and so what some talk about identity formation coming from what I produced before the 60s to what I consumed and what makes me different than the other since the 70s, and now what I create sort of generally amongst sort of millennials and beyond. Is just that is more identity forming than what I consumed, the things I bought versus the things I produced at work, before that. So yeah, that blurring of lines, yeah. Go ahead.
I think to one of your earlier points, and I'm curious what other people think about this too, I'm still wrestling with whether or not social media and technology, how much it can help in having the difficult conversations. Because I do feel that they're easier had at someone's home with food on the table. And you don't necessarily have that online. I do know of some studies that have been done on prejudice reducing by introducing people of opposite views on a forum. But I'm also wondering if those people coming there knew, hey, I'm coming here to experience someone's opposing view, and seeing if we can build some commonality. Because I've personally been frustrated in creating all these events and doing lots of icebreakers and dinners and bringing people together, and then they became Facebook friends, and then something happened in the media, and then, the Muslim and the Christian had a very different perspective on that. In this particular, I think it was Israel-Palestine or something. And it ended up in deep unfriending and anger and even further away of I don't want to do what you're doing anymore because this person that I now became friends with online, and I see more of their views, it made me more upset and wanting to stop that journey. You know what I mean? And so I'm curious, is it possible that those places where change is needed, when people have prejudices and biases? There's enough study to show, seeing positive images in film and all that does help to change. But can you have those conversations with people online? Is that possible? I don't know.
I make it a point to, if I'm putting out very progressive content, like on gun control and stuff, and, I have on my feed folks that, are conservative on that issue, and they'll post. I feel like I've been educated, and my perspective has shifted because they made some valid points. And so, I could have unfriended them, things have gotten heated, but that's again, that as you said, that just depends on you as a person, what you're shaping your online presence to be. But I think we're sincerely there to learn ourselves and be educated and open to it. I know for sure I'll be standing corrected several times. But I do have the honor of Mikal saying that I was the first Muslim to have her in the house.
In your home, yeah.
I don't know if it was iftar or not. So that was the beginning of a wonderful conversation with you and your dad. So that is meaningful.
In our classrooms, this isn't interreligious, but intra-religious. Like in my online classes, I'll have folks experience Orthodox Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, Pentecostal, and emerging. They'll go to those communities offline and experience them, do those practices, and come talk. For some, that's their native community. For some, they've never done that. And by experiencing it and then talking about it, there's in our classes, so in our conversations, we'll have, I never thought a Catholic was a Christian. they'll have comments like that, a Christian in their sense. Or a Baptist, I never thought they had the fullness of the Spirit, like a Pentecostal might say that or something. And so they're having those experiences. So they are doing this online. They're not physically meeting, but they've given permission to me to create a structure for them to encounter difference. It may be more difficult in unstructured spaces, but I know in the structured online space, we can create those opportunities for the other to learn and understand and see transformation. You can really see students start to grapple with what it means to practice something different than they thought before, and have some of these engaged conversations. So I think part of it is what's around the structures behind the spaces. So
I think in my work, even in dialogue, that when you meet just once, sometimes that can be more damaging than not having met at all, right? In my work, I talk about it as episodic empathy, where in that moment, you build a community and you have an episode of empathy with someone else. But if it isn't developed further, Hal Saunders talks about the idea of sustained dialogue. And so if we're talking particularly about dialogue, which I think happens in so many ways, I do think that one of the benefits of the online piece or digital technology is the capacity to be able to process a lot of information and exposure. But it has to happen with a good facilitator. You know, technology itself is not, it can be, if left unmitigated, is not a facilitator unto itself. So it still needs the human aspect of facilitation. And so again, as you know, getting together here, we're in a dialogue with one another. If we had a terrible facilitator, it would have gone a very different way. I wanted to point out, I think there's another piece of technology we're not talking about, which is the representation of our culture through particularly news media. And one of the biggest divides I think we face in our country is not really around religion as much as it is a tribalism around political identity. And I don't think we have spaces where people are talking to one another, and a demonstration of more spaces where we're talking to one another. I don't even think we're at the place where people are able to speak to one another, but to have representations of folks speaking to one another across religious boundaries, but also across these political boundaries, is in some ways sacrilegious right now. I work around in places of violence around the world, and I remember speaking with people of different traditions, and they said, we can't meet publicly because if we do, on our way home, we'll be shot. And in many ways, I feel like the shooting in the virtual space is not the embodied shooting, but we have religious leaders who, when they step too far out with other traditions, get essentially reeled back in. So I think one of the things we can think about is how do we, the performativity of religion, how do we think through productive ways that go across religious lines, but also I think particularly for the American context, but I would say transnationally right now, demonstrate ways of engaging in those difficult conversations. So maybe you have the difficult conversation and you document it. I don't think we have enough documentation of successful stories of very difficult scenarios and situations, because it's hard once you're documenting, it changes that process. So how do you balance the documentation with the actual process? Because human contact theory is the basis for almost all interreligious dialogue. And it is based, to think of Levinas, you know, that dignity face to face. How do we scale up what we're all doing face to face?
So in America right now, we've lived very segregated, isolated existences. And some of us, obviously it's a very diverse panel, some of us have broken through the isolation and the monolithic natures of the communities that we've come from to start to have interdialogues amongst various categories, right? And so we're bridges. And two things that I've noticed about people who are bridges is that it's hard, right? Because you come from one community that you really understand and you have a dream and a vision or trauma or whatever's driving you to get to another place to pioneer something, and you go into a community that understands your dreams and your hopes and your visions, but it doesn't necessarily understand where you come from and your culture. So you sit in the middle of that trying to have a conversation. So we need to create more supportive spaces for the cross-disciplinarians and the pioneers, because when we support each other, then we can start to demonstrate in various places our relationships that we're having with people who are different from us. And it's in those demonstrations that we reflect back to both communities, oh, it's possible, right? Because for in both communities, people don't know that it's possible. And I come from inner city Philadelphia, which is a very predominantly African-American sort of community. There are people who come from my community who've never engaged with people who are different across many different levels, right? And then I come into University of Southern California, which it is very different. And so if I'm in my Facebook and I'm having a conversation with my professor who's from Greece, and she comments on my post, she's commenting on my post right under my cousin or girlfriend who is in Philadelphia, and they're seeing this interaction. But facilitating all that can be daunting. And so where are the support systems for the people who are doing that to keep them strong and to keep them fueled as they start to help other people become bridges in that sense?
So somebody, there's an online discussion thread, somebody put a good idea, maybe good for your friendship class, actually.
Yeah.
They said, you know, how people used to have pen pals, maybe they could be Skype pals, you know. That's kind of a, you know, support group. But you're right, the restricted access. I mean, we talk about, you know, within the American context, our community definitely engages in interfaith affairs, but in a global stage, it's, you know, highly restricted. Just the access to social media is restricted. There was a time then, you know, people were commenting that social media will provide safe spaces for people, say, in the Middle East. More, you know, societies are considered repressive or repressed. So, but, I mean, I don't think that's panned out really all that well. And I had somebody from Medina who connected me through a family friend and wanted to receive a consultation for the family member's case. It was a neurological case. And, you know, I don't have an international plan on my phone, and this person kept calling on my phone, and I texted him, I said, I really don't have an international plan. Can we do WhatsApp? And this poor guy said, you know, the WhatsApp is really restricted in the kingdom here. This was from Saudi Arabia. So, and that's that's the largest medium of communication in the world. I mean, so again, we don't necessarily have the access to carry the dialogue to a certain level that we think we may have. That's another restriction.
I have one success story which gets me really excited. I find Twitter to be easily navigable because of hashtags. And so last fall, they were celebrating Nelson Mandela Madiba's, I think his 100th birthday in South Africa. And they put on an amazing show of people of all races and colors and religions performing and giving speeches in honor of Nelson Mandela. And Beyonce performed. And so Beyonce performed, but she opened up her show with 2 songs that I was not familiar with. They were South African songs, and I didn't know the songs. So I got on Twitter, and I said, #Black Twitter South Africa. Tell me the name of these songs. And people responded to me right away and told me, like, which songs they were. And in that instant moment of connection, I found out about music in South Africa that I would have never had access to in any traditional setting. So it can work.
It absolutely can work, because the frame that I've done in my work is to approach it as a public scholar. So whenever I can, to put out information, but also I've had so many people come up to me at conferences and say, you know, I came to hear you speak because I always mix the relational with the informational. It is an alchemy that I'm very aware of in my presence online. And I think that allows for those that connect to it to want to see me in real life, sometimes too much, but want to see me in real life. But I think on top of it, it's not, for me, it's not about breaking stereotypes of Muslim women. It's about just being human with the perfect and the imperfect, sharing stories that inspire others. But also sometimes the failures also humanize us with each other. But I've found it really, I guess for me, the online presence and the digital and the online teaching have been spaces where the platform allows for a kind of connection that is really, in some ways, once it carries in other forms of engagement, has been very transformational for me as well, because sometimes there's no one in my community that had the experience. I'll end with this. I think clergy sexual abuse. I spoke at a major conference here in Southern California, but I saw the interfaith organizing, but it was also the storytelling for a Muslim woman to know it doesn't just happen in the Muslim community, but it happens in other traditions. And so I think that in some ways, the interfaith communities are being built by the sub-communities of subject matter interests that motivate people. And that's powerful. How do we translate that to a wider engagement is probably one of the future questions for us to address.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Super enlightening. And again, I think some early first steps, because some of what we would say, like we don't have data on what life with technology is. And so some of this is us together saying, what does it look like? What does this future that we can't quite see yet, and we don't have, a historic data. Facebook started in 2007. It's like a baby, right? But it's radically changed reality in many ways. And so I think especially our task of saying, can we identify the ways where this leads to isolation and loneliness and fragmentation, but then also lean into the ways where it opens up access and it unites the voiceless and the marginalized and those who suffer under injustices of various kinds, but religious kinds often, to give them platforms, I think is really interesting. And for me anyway, the hard conversations are always going to be hard no matter what. But I think, at least as I think about a Christian community for my own sort of constituency, how transformative it is simply for them to witness a conversation that is constructive and positive with people of different faiths. That because of the representation issues in the media and whatnot, I think there is a deep sort of cynicism or skepticism that it's even a possibility. So I would just want to encourage you all to recognize that, my hopes, again, delusions of grandeur maybe, but a little product like this, of us getting around and just sort of workshopping the goods, the bads, the in-betweens, is something that actually could contribute to something quite positive, I think, for many people. And then I'll speak for myself. I was telling Ryan earlier, I went out to this, they call it a regenerative farm, not a sustainable farming anymore. And there's a documentary about it, so I went and visited and talked to the farmers and stuff. And it was this really fascinating thing of them trying to do not just organic farming or sustainable farming, but they're really trying to take soil that had been killed essentially by prior practices and breathe life back into it through these different practices. And it's essentially biodiversity, right? Like you have all sorts of different things. Okay. But their story is when they would get one success, like they'd get the apricot orchard growing, then that would invite all these other pests, the snails, right? And then they're overwhelmed with snails. And they're like, what do we do next? Well, let's bring in the ducks. And then the ducks kill all the snails. But then it's all of their manure causes all the flies to, And so and at one point in the documentary that this is about, one of the farmers says, this just feels like overwhelming. What's this going to be like? And in that spot, I was talking to them, and he said, our greatest tool is observation plus creativity plus humility. And he goes, as a farmer, all of these issues are inviting me into a deeper collaboration with the land and the ecosystem. And if I can go through that, if I can sit back and observe what's going on, and then I can be creative and then get to the humility part as fast as possible. And he said, because today's answers aren't tomorrow's answers, and they weren't yesterday's. And in fact, I'll probably fail in what my solution is right now. And if I can get to that humility part faster, I will be a better farmer. I will actually be able to cultivate this land in a life-giving, constructive way. And I walked away from there going, what an amazing way to think about technology as we go, if I can lead my religious community to get to humility faster, as fast as possible, that's the posture I want to encourage them. And it's personally what I want to adopt as well, as I hear from you all, learn from you all, hopefully invite you to call me out on my failures and mistakes as well. But I'm really, really appreciative of you all taking the time, the energy, the thoughtfulness to join us.